Okay, today we have Mark Bergfeld, and he's going to talk about the management of migration, trade unions, and self-organization of migrants. It is a very important issue because we know that Brexit is becoming more and more of a reality, and in Europe there are lots of problems with the countries, states who are receiving plenty migrants. And as you know, President Trump has promised to build a wall, some 12 meters high wall between America and Mexico. So there are lots of issues to be tackled with. It is not only the courts of justice or high courts in these countries which are important, but the migrants' self-organization and the unions fight for migrants is also important. So I give the word to Mark.
Thank you very much. So this is the third time that I've been here, right?
Yeah.
So the first time we spoke about Turkish guest worker strikes in Germany. Then last time we spoke about, I think, strategies in trade union strategies and Brexit. And now we're doing more theoretical overview of all of these issues. So I'm really happy that people came. And I'm really happy, that we, keep this relationship going, So it's been enriching intellectually. So what I'll do today is I'll try to give a perspective on the management of migration, as well as on trade unions and the way they relate to immigrant workers and the issue of migration. And I'll try to connect various insights from my PhD, as well as from various writings, and as well as some trade union work that I had been previously engaged in. So, in terms of migration, the thing is, the way that I want to actually look at migration today is about how do borders capture labor? Because I think if we put that front and center of our analysis, we start to understand the way in which borders act as a way to control, in order to control the working classes. First of all, through an international division of labor. So constructing some countries in the international division of labor as labor exporting countries. So if you look at contemporary Philippines, for example, as a labor exporter of migrant nurses, domestic workers, and different types of workers, or if you look, for example, the role that Eastern European countries such as the Ukraine play as well in terms of sending immigrants for domestic work, or various other countries such as Poland. You see nurses coming to Germany, so you can see how an international division of labor might occur. At the same time, you have labor receiving countries such as Germany, Britain, which are marked by high degrees and high percentages of immigration. And through that, you actually can see that over time, and as time continues, and Saskia Sassen, a very famous sociologist, has pointed that out, this kind of international division of labor actually contributes to the existing inequalities that persist, and should be also understood as a way in which the imperialist countries of the global north and in Western Europe seek to control flows of labor, as well as seek to control financial flows. So what we see is in Europe at the moment, and I think concentrating on Europe gives us a really good view, is that often academics or often even campaigning groups will be speaking about Fortress Europe. They will say Europe is a fortress, and we can see it by the fact that more than 3,000 people died in the Mediterranean in 2017. since I think Frontex was, which is one of the border programs, border control programs, has been installed, more than 23,000 immigrants died crossing the Mediterranean Sea. The real number, of course, is unknown. But what we can see is actually that, looking at the International Division of Labor, is that Europe isn't as much as a fortress. The borders are much more porous. They're permeable. They let certain groups come in and let certain groups come through, and other groups are seen as undesirable or not wanted. And so we can take, for example, the case of the summer of 2015, when Germany opened its borders and defied the Dublin III regulations, which regulate migration inside of Europe. That the whole talk was about, oh, you know, Syrian refugees coming to Germany, or Syrian doctors coming to Germany. So these, even though they were refugees and needed international protection and international humanitarian aid, immediately this kind of division was made between these immigrants are considered good immigrants because they contribute, because they can contribute to the German economy, for example. In other cases, we actually see how there are channels are created in order to let particular groups of immigrants in. So if we look at the kind of programs that European EU countries have with the Philippines, for example, in terms of care workers and foreign nurses, you can see that these are again desired workers, and for example, that workers from Africa are considered unskilled. So it is a quite recent development, this kind of differentiation between good and bad migrant, but where we can trace it back to is actually the Treaty of Rome inside of the European Union, which made a division between countries of the EEC and non-EEC countries. Because that, for example, in the case of Turkish guest workers that came to Germany before 1968, 1967, actually, they were both treated in the same way, creating with the Treaty of Rome and enshrining the free movement of labor inside of the European Economic Zone, actually meant creating a division between Turkish guest workers and Greek guest workers and Spanish guest workers who belong to the European Economic Zone. And so you can see that more than being the fortress of Europe, which continuously bars people from coming in to Europe, actually the borders create a system of differentiation of what kind of, and I think that is the point really to take away with it. So you see, for example, Trump's border wall. If we read, the erection of Trump's border wall in that vein, you can see how in the border city of Tijuana, Mexico, they have, this high 12-meter wall. They have computer sensor systems so that people won't cross over. They have the newest kind of technology of bordering in that region. But if you walk towards the Rio Grande, it's only a river, again, that separates the United States and Mexico. And even up in some areas of Arizona, there's no border wall and there's just a little barbed wire fence. The reason being that borders also try to channel particular migration and particular routes of migration being taken. And so the way that we can understand it in the European context is, for example, in the summer of 2015, when migrants took the Balkan route to come into the European Union. It then was later closed off, so that migrants wouldn't be stuck, and so that migrants would be stuck in Greece. And so what we see in the American case with trying to channel people through Arizona and through a mountainous region, through the desert, and through the Rio Grande is really a kind of principle based on the survival of the fittest. It is only those immigrants which are actually worthy of coming here because they've put so much effort into migrating, that they are allowed to come into the country, which raises considerable ethical concerns. The third principle of bordering is actually a tendency of deterritorialization that we see. And by the deterritorialization of borders, what we need to understand is that the EU's outer borders are actually not where, where they currently lie, on the outside of Greece, in Lesbos, or in the Mediterranean, in Sicily, or on its east, but through agreements with third countries such as Turkey, the EU's outer border is actually at the Syrian-Turkish border nowadays. So anyone coming from Syria, coming through Turkey, if they are registered as a refugee in Turkey, immediately are stuck in Turkey for the time being. The same can be said actually about the kind of deals that the European Union has done with Libya most recently, with Mali, with Egypt, Tunisia. All these countries now have migration agreements, third states agreement, in which these countries count as safe states, and so migrants and refugees can both be deported back to those countries and will find it difficult to leave those countries in order to access the European Union. And so this is a relatively new tendency, but I think it's a significant one because it actually again controls and creates a system of differentiation where certain migrants then might be able to move on and others have to remain in those countries. In the case of Britain, we see that this principle of deterritorialization taking hold in Calais, for example. That is the de facto British border, where refugees are being kept in a camp, which now has, of course, been destroyed. But nonetheless, what we see is that having to come through this funnel in a way in Calais means that Britain controlled partially territory in France. So it also has implications for how we see states, and the development of states in the near future. How, what does sovereignty mean going forward if, you have borders outside of the state's borders as well as. And in the United States, of course, the Mexican government plays that function in funneling Central American refugees from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala through. The other consideration I think we need to take account of when we're talking about bordering and we're talking about the dimension of to what extent borders try to capture labor and control working class mobility is actually labor market policies. And often this is a neglected dimension, to what extent countries and states can play an active role in shaping labor market policies, which then have an indirect consequence on the way that flows of migration occur. So if you look at, for example, the care sector, is that there's been a lack of training in the care sector. The care sector is totally devalued in terms of its salaries and wages. That it has for more than 10 years, or for the last 2 decades, has relied on the import of care workers from Eastern Europe or from third countries in the global south. And you could see how a progressive labor market policy of skilling native-born workers, etc., would also create would reshuffle flows of migration. So we see that, for example, happening in, there's a case in Ireland where, for example, they were dependent on plumbers, importing handymen, manual laborers, etc., and through retraining their workforce and skilling their workforce, that it actually reconfigured migration and that migrants no longer came to Ireland because the opportunities were lacking for labor market advancement. And so in doing so, they can encourage or discourage migration. So, for example, the big fear around raising tuition fees in the UK to £9,000 was for a long time that, well, all the international students who were coming here in terms of going into the universities would quit coming to the UK and would go to other countries instead. But I don't have any figures on that. And so, in particular, what we see is in summing up on how borders try to capture labor, is that this differentiation in Europe in particular runs, as I said, between EU and non-EU, but this has been enshrined since 1968 with the Treaty of Rome that we saw. It also makes the differentiation between workers from the global south or from African countries, from wherever in the world, between high-skilled and low-skilled. So you see in Britain, you see the five-tier immigration system, and you see in the way in which Britain tries to attract the most highly skilled workers or employees to Britain, but also effectively bar those without skills from entering Britain. However, the kind of question of skills is a very cultural notion, in the sense that it doesn't actually account for how immigrant communities understand skills. So, for example, the Chinese studies have shown that the Chinese and Indian communities in Britain have had a hard time because of the skills definition of bringing over cooks and kitchen staff from their countries in order to fill the labor shortages within their restaurants. And that shows you that, for example, cooking Indian food or cooking Chinese food is not considered a skill by British standard. Now you can go through a various lists of, okay, what is seen as useful to the British economy, and of course then it would be deemed, a skill. The other thing that we see is we see and this is what Bridget Anderson, the famous migration scholar from Oxford, has argued, that what you see is the creation actually of the migrant worker whose worth or value in society is solely based on the value of his or her labor. And so you can see how, in some ways, it's a meritocratic form of integration. So if you look at the policies that follow from that, you can see that in Britain, under David Cameron signed off the deal that EU citizens would no longer be entitled to benefits coming to the UK unless they had lived here longer than 5 years, which again shows that EU migrants are only welcome here if they're actually working and find employment. Otherwise, they should move on to the next country. And so we see this kind of form of integration. Now, this form of integration actually causes segmentation in the labor market, because it effectively means that immigrant workers, rather than trying to work, at their skill level, rather than working at their education level of educational attainment, are continuously forced to go into the kinds of jobs that are currently only on offer and available, which re-entrenches the kind of division of labor within the UK. And so we see, in that sense, that you see a creation of a secondary labor market. So the whole argument around, are migrants putting pressure on wages, is actually not a question of migrants' agency of putting pressure on wages, but it is a combination of policies, which means that the labor market is continuously undermined through, and the security in the labor market is continuously undermined through the combination of labor market policy, migration policies, and ultimately the kind of meritocratic integration that you see. On a final point in that regard, I think it's important to speak about how the state no longer has, in some ways, outsourced parts of its integration policies to civil society, to trade unions, and to other stakeholders in society, as well as has tied in civil society in the management and control of migration. So, for example, now people in Britain need to show whether they're legal when they're renting a place, or, for example, need to confirm that or need to confirm their immigration status to their employers, etc. In doing so, the state actually saves, in cost, saves in and tries to externalize the cost of the control of immigration to other actors. So, where do trade unions fit into all of this? So I think it's worth stating that, and we can have a bit of a discussion around it. I think it's worth stating that there's a million of trade unions or thousands of trade unions which have all had different policies, right? So it's kind of difficult to make general arguments about labor unions. But I do think that what we saw from the mid-1980s, 1990s, and then coming into the early 2000s, it can be considered a historic shift in going from kind of exclusionary policies and protectionist policies, going back into a kind of open immigration framework in which unions once again started to place a greater emphasis on representing migrants, organizing immigrants, and servicing them as well. And that change in union policy was the product of a combination of different factors. So we see in the United States that a number of unions in textile and as well as in the growth of the service sector, particularly in janitorial services, started organizing immigrants because they became the main demographic within the union movement and within the workforce. So there really was a strong need to think, okay, we're faced with union decline, and at the same time we have a new key constituency within our unions that actually are willing to join the unions, that are coming into the unions. At the same time as well, there was the challenge of globalization and the whole kind of discourse of globalization in the 1990s. And so the unions were finding themselves in a institutionally weaker situation in which they no longer had power over the control of no longer power inside of the labor market, and no direct mechanisms of wage setting and wage control. And so it was obvious that they needed to shift their strategies in some ways. In Britain, I think there was a change in the change actually started in the 1970s, particularly with the TUC Congress in 1976, where you saw that, for example, the black workers struggled. There had been a number of independent rank-and-file strikes by black workers, so that a combination of independent self-organization amongst black workers from the Caribbean and Asian workers from the former colonial countries, as well as left-wing shop stewards within the union movement, and a growing number and a demographic change contributed to the TUC adopting an anti-racist framework, to effectively using the new wave of immigration and incorporating these workers into their union structures, and in particular into the self-organized structures, which now are quite well known. So, and then of course the question begs itself: okay, how did the unions respond to Polish migration? And in some ways, they actually left it to the state to provide. The unions by 2004 had been in a far weaker situation than in the 1970s. And so what you saw was that instead of actually putting safeguards in place in the labor market, the then Labour government under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown actually put a fund aside, the Union Modernization Fund, and various other funds for English classes for Eastern European migrant workers coming to, that would allow the union to get into contact with so-called immigrant workers. Now, there are limits to those, state-financed initiatives, because they took place, as research suggests, on the basis of the third way, community cohesion, instead of actually trying to strengthen the union movement as a whole. And so what you see is that through that you see that in some ways the union movement participates in the management of migration, or even in acts of bordering. In so far that, and I've shown this in a paper on Germany, that the state simply adopts a country's immigration policy. So for example, in 2004, the trade union movement accepted the opening of the labor market to aid immigrants from Eastern Europe, whilst in Germany, where the state didn't allow Polish immigrants to come and work in Germany on a regular basis, actually the union supported that move. And what you see is that trade unions act in this way and try to support their government's migration policy in order to gain leverage in other areas of labor market policy. And so they conduct a trade-off between those two arenas. The thing is that through some of the initiatives, for example, that you see, that a lot of the kind of divisions that I outlined in before in the division of labor and the secondary labor market and the primary labor market, a lot of those divisions remain entrenched rather than challenged by the trade union movement, unfortunately. Given that trade unions remain membership organizations, they first and foremost are responsible for their membership rather than for the working class as a whole. And so often you will see, and my field work showed that in particular workplaces where there's permanent staff and agency staff, that the union puts its emphasis in servicing and organizing onto the permanent staff rather than the agency staff, which is predominantly immigrant in nature. And so in terms of that, it's implicitly unions reinforce the moral value of labor and accept some of the very parameters that the state has laid out through its immigration and labor market policy. And so we see different ways in which this even has been challenged. So there's very good examples that have arisen in recent years within the union movement in the United States, in Germany, in Britain, in France, where actually the union movement has started to challenge these entrenchments that I've described. So in France, for example, in 2008, a number of African workers who were working in restaurants there went on strike and demanded that their employers actually sign their documentation forms, and were very successful in winning documentation from their employers, and their employers supporting their efforts to gain rightful employment in the country. In what we see in the US is that more and more unions are providing pathways to citizenship, in which they consult, in which they help undocumented Latino and other immigrant workers in the US to find a pathway to citizenship and no longer be undocumented. And in the UK, we see similar efforts in terms of union learning, trade union education, which have taken place over the last couple of years. However, because of the entrenchment between agency workers and permanent staff, as well as the division of labor between in the labor market, we see also as one of its byproducts migrant worker self-organization arise. So on one level, migrant worker self-organization can take various forms. It can take the form of homeland politics, in which, you know, political parties which existed in the homeland also set up in the new country of arrival. So, for example, you saw in the wake of the Southern European Eurozone crisis, you saw Podemos Spanish migrants set up Podemos branches. You saw Greek immigrants here in London set up their Syriza branches. But you also saw it, and I imagine you know more about it in Germany, you know, various Turkish organizations, you know, start building their own, you know, the parties that they have from their home country and start building them up. You can also see that ethnic mobilization, so-called ethnic mobilizations take place. So in particular, because immigrant workers experience discrimination in the labor market, as I suggested, experience discrimination by landlords, by the police, by different authorities, that immigrant communities will develop some networks of resistance, or what Sivanandan has called communities of resistance, in which they support each other informally, formally, and they come together around common concerns and create the basis for a different kind of politics on a kind of ethnic or immigrant or racialized basis. The third one is a class unity perspective which self-organization can take. So, for example, in my field work, I found a number of immigrant worker groups which, even though they were organizing in the secondary labor market, in ethnic niches where predominantly Latin American workers were working, or only Spanish or only Polish workers were working, that you saw that they were trying to build links with the established trade union movement in order to further the cause of trade unionism on the whole, despite being excluded. And so the way to look at self-organization is that often by the trade union movement it is seen as something hostile towards the trade union movement. However, actually what we can see historically is that self-organization often led to greater levels of integration. So, for example, when I spoke about the Turkish guest worker strikes here a couple of years ago, I mentioned the way in which the wildcat strikes in Köln and in Neuss, for example, were directed against the trade union bureaucracy as well as against the employers. But inadvertently, the trade union, even though they were hostile to the initial demands of the strikers, incorporated those demands, and in the following years, like as my research has shown, actually more Turkish workers actually had joined the Works Council, had official positions within the trade unions, because they experienced the limits of their conflictual modes of action. And so what you see is that self-organization can be a tool of empowerment for immigrant communities, given the kind of discrimination they face, and act as a way as a conduit for integration. So the current self-organization that I describe in my research often doesn't achieve those heights. So we aren't seeing strikes by immigrant workers to such a large degree that we can talk about a real challenge to the trade union movement and its forms its current form. And we can't really say that the current forms of immigrant self-organization really challenge the acts of bordering and the management of migration and the control of immigration explicitly. However, imminently, the fact that despite political exclusion and despite having nearly to no political rights, that immigrant workers continue to organize, actually challenges actually puts a challenge forward to the kind of forms of democracy that are possible in our nation states. The second thing to say is that actually the kind of collective ties that are built, along the migration route and inside of the new country also start to challenge the way in which social relations are formed. So they take a collectivist nature, and so we don't need to think about immigration any longer simply as an individual act of, the homo economicus. It always was seen as like immigrant workers were solely migrating to a place for economic reasons. They were migrating for the most, selfish reasons to advance individually in the labor market. But what I think the way we should look at it is that actually immigrant communities are networked, they're dependent upon each other in order to advance. And so even if it doesn't take an obvious organized form, as in the form of trade unionism or immigrant worker self-organization, advancement in the labor market is collective, at least at a subterranean or on an imminent level. So in what we also see is in terms of various different campaigns, immigrant worker campaigns. For example, in London there's a group called the United Voices of the World, or there's the Industrial Workers of Great Britain, and various different. These again actually fill a vacuum that the trade union movement has left. As the trade union movement has declined, as it's no longer taking radical approaches to organizing workers in these labor markets, these trade unions have stepped in and filled the void that was left by the decline in unionism. And in many ways, they mirror the tactics of what we would expect from trade unions in those sectors. However, I think some of challenges arise in regards to that. First of all, in many cases, they are able to win. They're able to win wage theft cases, or they're able to win wage raises. But if we look at the way that all the industries, whether it's janitorial services, or whether it's the hotel industry, or whether it's the care sector, to a large extent, industry, we haven't gone back to a point where wages are being set or where industry standards are changing for the positive. So a lot of immigrant worker organizations, because they're small in size, actually can take on individual employers, but we aren't in a position currently where we can start, thinking about how do we shape different industries on the whole. So some of the dynamics, if we believe that we're dealing with a labor market which is separate to some extent from the primary labor market, some of the dynamics playing out in those labor markets are actually autonomous from the stuff happening in the public sector or in the wider trade union movement. And so to what extent the lessons can be applied from those campaigns, even when successful, to other arenas of trade unionism remains questionable in my view. So in conclusion, and I've spoken a bit too long, in conclusion, I think focusing on management of migration and on immigrant self-organization gives us a way of looking beyond the liberal, conservative, or right-wing, or social democratic view of looking at migration. The liberal view of looking at migration says, oh, these poor migrants, they're all victims. The conservative view says, let them just come here and work at Pret-a-Manger. The right-wing view will say, we don't want them whatsoever, as Trump says, and the social democratic view says we just need to integrate them into the labor market as quick as possible. But looking at the management of migration in terms of what I did, as well as looking at self-organization, actually can show us of how agency develops as part and parcel of the policies, labor market policies, as well as migration policies put forward by the state. So in conclusion, the self-organization and autonomous logic of migrants' political action means that it can't always be integrated into, and will not allow itself to be integrated into the management of migration, but it will continuously try to circumvent the management of migration. And so for unions, it isn't necessarily about, or shouldn't necessarily be just simply about integrating migrants into pre-existing structures, etc., but paying attention to, you know, the forms of self-organizations, the communities of resistance, and playing and showing solidarity with those forms of struggle, both, you know, in financial terms, but also in terms of general resources. That's it.
That's it. Okay, first we take any questions, then we continue with the comments. I have one question before everybody. Now, the integration of, or the need of migration into one country has also something to do with the birth rates of the receptive nation. For example, Britain or Germany. If we accept their present birth rates, if also we assume that the economies are not shrinking, they need migrants. Whether the political people refuse them, create lots of problems or not, the economies need migrants.
Yeah. I'll come. Should we take a few questions first, or?
That's my question anyway.
I was surprised that you didn't make a distinction between migrants and refugees.
Yeah.
Came to my mind because I think it is a really very different category.
My question is, what's the excuses, the governments managing the migration, because they don't talk about humanitarian side of the issue. What's the main excuse of it? You know, they always talking about how much does it cost us, what did they bring us? They always capitalist. The approachable matter. And there is nothing humanitarian.
My question is about the current Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn's position on migration and freedom of movement. I'm just wondering what you thought of the current position of the party and how far you think it will change over the series, over the next few years. How much space is there within this new social democratic revival in Britain, which for some people at the heart of the project seemingly wants to go back to this 1950s, 1960s golden age with a welfare state, some nationalised industries, a mixed economy, full employment, raising wages. And with that, going back to the 50s, you had a very liberal or patrician immigration policy with the former, with the colonial world. How far, but we see currently that has been actually the opposite, in that there's been moved back to the 1950s golden age of a social democratic Britain, but on the other hand, been quite conservative when it comes to immigration policy, and that seems to me quite a contradictory one. I would also, maybe if you could talk about some of the contradictions inside of the Labour Party policy, that Jeremy Corbyn's first act as leader was to go on a refugee solidarity march. But, so I maybe talk through the question of refugee and migrants and apply it specifically to the Labour Party in a political context.
Should I get back to some of
the first round?
Okay, so I think your point regarding the fact that countries like Germany, Britain, France, Italy, they all need immigrants in terms of because there's a lack of labor supply without immigrants, given the low birth rates. But I think that the crucial point to mention here is it's not only the birth rate, because you can have a demographic argument around the birth rates, but I think in a lot of industrial sectors or service sectors, the wages are so low that people actually do not want to work in those sectors. So you can see, for example, the care sector in Germany, there's something 160, according to one study, 160 people are missing in the German care sector. And instead of actually paying people decent wages so that you would want to work in the care sector, they're importing Polish or Spanish migrants, and there shouldn't be a problem with that whatsoever. But they continuously they use the demographic argument to detract from the fact that the wages are so low, and that if people actually could live off of the wages in those sectors, then you probably would also find enough workers to work in those sectors. And I think that exposes the contradiction at the heart of nation state and capitalism, because capitalism needs the free mobility of labor. Wherever there's growth, it needs workers to go there, it needs workers to work there, and humans have always traveled and migrated there where work was needed, where there was an economy, whether it was better pastures as peasants or wherever. And I think the nation state, though, because politicians win elections on the basis of making appeals to nationalism and to the nation, and making the distinction between insiders and outsiders, it comes actually into conflict with the needs of capital to attract workers to particular states. So I think that's one point to raise. The second thing is in terms of the differentiation between refugees and migrants. I might have not made it explicit enough. Of course, refugees under the UN definition of 1947, the Geneva Convention, are different from migrants, insofar that they should actually, get acceptance in, they should be. So the rule states, the Geneva Convention states, that they actually should get asylum somewhere in a safe country. However, and they can leave their country. However, they're actually, it doesn't state whether they can enter a particular country. So, and that's a problem at the heart of the definition of refugee. So you see refugees in a continuous state of limbo. That actually means that people who are often who would get refugee status often do not get refugee status because they have entered a wrong country, or they have entered a country through a wrong route, or you see them in a limbo situation where they're denied, they're denied to work, or they're denied, basic necessities. For example, in Italy, you see a lot of refugees entering Italy, and what oftentimes happens is they're stuck into camps without any kind of ability to build their lives, etc. And refugees, in my opinion, of course, we shouldn't value them just in terms of their labor, but in order to they hardly ever have a chance to go back to the country where they originally came from, because it will be either torn up through war or it will be destroyed, etc. So it means they need to be able to create a living basis in their new country, and often that right is denied. Migrants, on the other hand, a lot of people, migrate for political reasons, economic reasons, personal reasons, etc. Now, the thing is what I think the shift has been in policy and discourse is that actually, in particular, the Conservative Party under David Cameron was able to portray refugees who needed humanitarian help as migrants just coming to Britain for economic reasons, and they just wanted to come to Britain in order to have a better life here. And of course that wipes out the whole kind of humanitarian obligation that Britain, a country like Britain has. And so we saw that happening. That conflation, though, is, I think, a product of the kind of policy, you know, that a lot of refugees that, you know, are politically persecuted, or that people whose country is torn up by civil war or other factors actually do not get refugee status. So, for example, people from Afghanistan, even though the Taliban control vast areas at the moment, for example, are no longer considered refugees in Germany and can be deported back to Afghanistan, despite the Taliban controlling bigger areas than ever before. 3 weeks ago or something, Iraqis, now that ISIS has been defeated, quote unquote, or has, you know, gone, you know, like into Afghanistan, suddenly they're deporting Iraqis, you know, back into. So I think I think I might have been implicit in that sense, because I think that a lot of the times states will try to dilute, you know, the kind of borders or the kind of category distinctions between refugees and migrants. In terms of your question with humanitarian or cost,
what is their excuses? They don't talk about humanitarian side of the management, you see.
Yeah.
What is their main excuse?
Yeah, I think their main excuses are quite obvious. I think that you can see how from the 1990s onwards in Britain, they particularly portrayed asylum seekers, you know, fleeing from former Yugoslavia as benefits grounders, as people who are leeching off the system, you know, who are a burden to the economic system on one hand. And also, I think another argument is that they actually do not hold, you know, like British values or European values, and thus there's no way to integrate them into, you know, the whole society, for example. So there's a whole discussion around in Germany at the moment to what extent, you know, Arab refugees coming to Germany actually hold anti-Semitic positions, because, you know, because they have the experience of Palestine and, you know, Israel being an aggressive military and geopolitical force in the Middle East, and so it is assumed that Syrian and Palestinian and Lebanese refugees in Germany are all anti-Semitic and thus do not, you know, like, and are backwards, you know, in their way of thinking. And so, you know, we need to think about, you know, integrating them through, you know, compulsory courses, or we need to make sure that we make a differentiation between those who supposedly are anti-Semitic and those who aren't. So I think they're always able to find, you know, excuses. Another one is, which has just come to my mind, is the whole kind of way in which immigrants and refugees both are seen as a security threat, right? Like, one of the reasons why Donald Trump, for example, put, you know, the Muslim ban into place is that he saw Muslim immigrants, as well as Syrian refugees, as a security threat to the United States, and thus tried to stop immigration. So I think there's a number of issues. So security, you know, economic, etc. And I think the most easily to debunk argument is the economic argument, because actually, you know, migrants and immigrants are far less dependent on welfare and social services than other groups, because they have their own community networks. You can see how they actually contribute, they have higher labor market participation rates. So there's ways of debunking the myth that refugees or immigrants cost the state more than they give back. In terms of the Labour Party and Corbyn, the thing is,
could I also just push on the Brexit as well? Sorry, I forgot to mention that. And their position on Brexit, which influences their position on immigration.
I think that the thing is that the debate in Britain has shifted over since 2004 and since the EU accession of Poland, Poland, and then after that Romania, Bulgaria, etc. The whole discussion on migration has been one around which, Britain at a time of economic growth in the mid-2000s, it welcomed all these workers, and now given that, British, across the country actually, economic figures are still lagging behind, and you actually only have economic growth in London and other major cities, you see how the tide has turned around that. And I think what the trade union movement in particular, Unite, has and Len McCluskey have put forward, an idea that we need some kind of safeguards, and speak about safeguards rather than controls in terms of migration. I don't think that, for example, Clive Lewis's suggestion for before immigrants enter the country, they should be members of trade unions can be a serious suggestion, because I think migration flows are so uncontrollable in some ways. People can just fly from all kinds of countries into Stansted or Heathrow and just overstay their visa and find work in some ways. And people will always find a way of migrating, whether it's through family reunification or whether it's through various means. And so I think that there's actually no way of safeguarding. What they should try to do, and this is what I really tried to outline with the way of management of migration, is to conduct labor and to design labor market policies which raise standards within particular industries. So even if you started to set for example in industries which have been subject to precarization, if you were to set certain skill levels, apprenticeship programs, etc., you would start to create labor market safeguards, which would mean that people can earn a decent wage because they have training, as well as you would undermine some of the cost cutting that happens in these particular industries. That's how I would attack the whole problem. So I don't, but of course for the companies that would actually act in a redistributive way. So whether that comes about and whether they're willing to invest into training and skills is a different agenda, but it can't be seen separate. And I think a lot of the discussions inside of the Labour Party are seen like, okay, labour market policy, skills and vocation are, like in John McDonnell's remit, as far as I've understood it, and like the immigration debate, because it's such a big debate around Brexit, is just seen as a kind of separate issue. But I think if you look at it economically and sociologically, you can't actually separate these things out. I also think that it would be foolish to believe that Britain would change in some ways even after World War II, accepting more than 40,000 Polish European volunteer workers, and in the 50s and 60s Caribbean and Asian migration to Britain, and then in the 70s as well. Then you come to all kinds of different. That suddenly London and Britain would not become a country of immigration, given the kind of international division of labour that is, and the setup that has been the case. I think in terms of Corbyn, I think he's under a lot of pressure from all kinds of sides, and I think that to some extent that what you see is that immigration is seen as a kind of hot potato that nobody really wants to touch, and I think the further it comes to the closer it comes to the next election. We saw in the case of Brexit that Brexit hardly played any role in the kind of discord election, June election, and so I think they'll try to steer away from any kind of discussion on immigration. That's my guess, because for them it's a lose-lose situation in some ways. I can't imagine that they'll say like open up all the borders, you know, let in all the refugees because, you know, we're internationalist, we're, you know, on the left. So I think the kind of protectionist line from the trade unions, I think, is going to dominate the discussion, but I think that it will play a very minor role given the way that they want, given the fact that they want to win the election and like the British electorate's concerns over migration. Any other questions?
No, I have, if there aren't any more questions just now. Right.
I just would like to ask about the self-organization, because you outline about that point.
Yeah.
I understand it is the outside of the trade unions movements, and I just wondering about that. If you have chance to look closer, how can they self-organize? What are their tools? How can they come together?
Any other questions?
I've got a cross between a question and a comment. Well, it's more a question really. It was interesting what you said about the contradiction between capitalism and the nation state, and that sort of mirrors what David Harvey, for instance, talks about, taking it from Origi, I don't know, quite sure, about
world systems.
About the contradiction between the logic of capital, or there being two logics in the present world, the logic of capital and the logic of territoriality. And there's a whole debate about whether capitalism actually requires the nation state, or whether it's simply that capitalism came on the scene when territoriality was already there, so it kind of inherited that. So whether there's an inherent logic within capitalism, within capital, for globalization and internationalization to smooth out the differences on a world scale, or whether capital would always have needed something like the nation state within which to operate as a vehicle through which it could operate, and there's arguments around that. That's obviously very pertinent as far as the question of migration is concerned, because capital is interested in workers competing amongst each other and driving wages and conditions down. So it's in the interests of capital, from one perspective, to have lots of migration, to have workers being able to suck workers from different parts of the world into places where capital is being accumulated. Also just simply from the need to have workers with different skills and all of that. But so there's that kind of perspective. So it is interesting that in the 19th century, in Britain, for instance, there weren't any immigration controls, and it's really only at the beginning of the 20th century, in response to the Jewish migration from Eastern Europe, that you began to have popular demands for immigration controls. And I wonder what you think the switch was about. Was it simply that it became easier to migrate, so you had larger flows of migration, and so the British nation state responded to that? Or was it something about the rise of the labour movement actually had a role in that? Because I was born in Australia, and it's quite clearly, you can see, for a long time Australia had what they called explicitly called a white Australia policy, and that came into force at the beginning of the 20th century, when Australia sort of got its independence, in response partly to what the labour movement was demanding. They had this thing about the yellow peril and so on. Australia actually being part of Asia, but having an Anglo-Saxon population and wanting to restrict the potential for Chinese and so on. And there was quite a lot of Chinese migration at the end of the 19th century. So you had workers, white workers organised to stop that. The same in South Africa after the First World War, with white labour unions actually having a general strike against black workers encroaching on the craft strongholds of white workers there. So you have this reactionary role potentially of trade unions, especially 100 years or so ago, which had an impact on the immigration controls coming in. There's also, as in response to the rise of labour movements, capitalist states start to develop welfare states that then potentially become more costs involved with having unemployed workers and having to educate and train workers. So perhaps it becomes more in the interests of capitalist states not to have an unrestricted flow of labour because of the costs that potentially come with that, but to control the kind of stuff you were talking about. They want to have skilled workers, but they want to do it in a controlled way. So perhaps that becomes more of an imperative once you start to have a welfare state.
Yeah.
I wanted to go a step further.
Yeah.
I've got a big book at home, which is called Migration History, and this background it's a book on migrations in human history, and migrations are regarded as the main agent in human development, innovation.
VAKFI.
It's edited by Jan Lucassen, Leo Lucassen. It's a book of the Institute of Historical Research in Amsterdam. Peter Langvadag. But I haven't. Well, one example which came immediately to my mind of recent date was the immigration of Jews to Austria and Germany produced an innovation which made Berlin and Vienna the center of innovation and avant-garde in the 1920s. But there are other examples. I mean, colonialism as a whole is an example of how migration is the source of human development and innovation. And we have to keep that in mind. It's not just skills for the labor market, it's also people coming with particular incentives themselves and it's changing the situation in the country where they migrate to. They don't just fill gaps, but they bring their own subjectivity.
I have two questions actually, which I don't think you have touched. How is the migration policy in the old Soviet bloc countries, starting from Russia, Poland, Hungary, Romania today? As far as I understand, the Russians do not want any migrants, but they have all these migrants coming from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and all the old Soviet republics, and they are trying to throw them back, much more uncivilized than the Westerns. My second question is that it seems if we compare Great Britain and Germany, the integrative approach of the bourgeoisie is more apparent in Germany in comparison to England. If we take as a measure the apprenticeships, as far as I read in the newspapers, the Germans, they have accepted around 900,000, 1 million people 2 years ago. Quite many hundreds of thousands have already been put into apprenticeship programs, which will make them a valuable labor force in the German working class. Whereas in Britain, as far as we learned from our last seminarist, Linda, last November, there is none. No apprenticeship programs in comparison to Germany. How do you comment on these?
Okay, I think I'll go through backwards. So I think it's very clear that in Germany, Thatcher got rid of the apprenticeships, and so in many cases, and so I think that what you see is you see a much greater segmentation of the labor market in Britain in some sectors than you see in Germany, and that you can see the number of people working on 0-hour contracts is proof of that. You see that labor market institutions such as trade unions are far weaker in the UK than in Germany, for example. But I think the ultimate reason why remains that the German export economy in particular requires kind of high-skilled manufacturing workers, and there's a lot of small, to medium-sized businesses and companies that are, the number one exporter, of some machine or some, high-end product in the world market. And so you can see that there's a continuous need to, skill and upskill workers in those particular sectors. Whereas, Britain puts this comparative advantage on the world market in terms of finance, in terms of and so I think that even though you have manufacturing, you still continue to have manufacturing despite what everyone else says here in Britain. It does remain low, and it doesn't take on the same significance. I don't know the I can't divide it by the figures. I don't have the figures.
9% is compared to 24%.
Yeah. Okay.
Germany has 24% manufacturing.
Yeah.
Britain 9%.
Okay, so that's so that gives you a view in terms of the kind of need for apprenticeship programs within those industries, and the fact that you need to upskill workers instead of, if you have a service economy where retail, warehouse work, logistics, etc., start to become the kind of dominant forms of work in which people are employed. So in warehousing, you hardly need any kind of skills unless you're driving a forklift. So you can train people up, but how many forklift drivers do you actually need with and these jobs are at risk of automation in most cases as well. So immigration policy in the old Soviet bloc, I think it's important to distinguish between kind of, the new European countries on the one hand, and like Russia and the countries like Tajikistan, etc. So we see very clearly that in Poland, Czech Republic, and the other Eastern European countries, that we see very strong anti-refugee and anti-migrant sentiment, as well as even street movements against migrant and right-wing political parties in power. Even we see right-wing political parties in power in Austria as well. So we see a kind of trend that started post the fall of the Berlin Wall, in which nationalism started to rise. I think we're now at a point where these forces, which were unleashed after the fall of the Soviet Union, now are the mainstream of political discourse in those countries. So you see, for example, in Poland, there recently was an article in The Guardian in which, because Poland's birth rates have rapidly declined since the fall of the Berlin Wall, they put an ad forward and they don't want migrants, where they said oh, you need to do it like the bunnies, so that the number of Polish people rises. And they had a whole ad campaign with bunnies and whatever, so that people would make more love. So that's the Polish route, to stemming population decline. I think you're pretty much looking into the wrong direction. But what's the Jane Hardy from Hertfordshire has outlined in terms of how, you know, Poland actually created itself as a labor exporting country in the mid-2000s. You know, Poland, in the book Poland's New Capitalism, she actually situates Poland in the International Division of Labor as a labor exporting country in which its entire policy was geared towards exporting young professionals, as well as exporting manufacturing and labor workers. And that was exacerbated by the privatization of the industries there, by closing down the factories, the coal mines, and all of that. In terms of Russia, I know that the Russians aren't very friendly towards immigrants and refugees. There are continuous news stories about the neo-Nazi movements there, but I actually have never dealt with, like, I've never researched Russia in regards to immigration, so maybe that's a meeting for another time.
There's a good reason.
Yeah, so it might be a good reason. So I can't give you any like answer on it. I would be lying, you know.
Before the fall of Soviet Union, they were propagating for the world working class.
Yeah.
And look at them now.
Yeah, that's for sure. So, in terms of your question, self-organization, how can immigrants self-organize? What kind of tools? I think it's important to mention following. I think that these workers and these immigrant workers transport their forms of struggles that they might have experienced from their home countries. They transport them to their new countries. So you, for example, see in the 1980s and in the 1990s and 2000s, you see in labor strikes in the US, for example, you see El Salvadorian workers that had confronted the military junta there, that effectively said, well, what's it, we can strike because in El Salvador we confronted the military. Or you, for example, see in the one seminar I did here, I showed of how, Turkish workers in Germany imported their forms of struggle to Germany. So you can see how the kind of collective ties and the collective experiences of the working classes in their home countries are transported and renegotiated in a new setting. Secondly, I think, so that is a crucial tool. So even though these workers do not have, the grand financial resources or do not always have union support, they're resourceful in the fact that they know, they have personal and biographical stories and identities that mean that they can fall back on in terms of their organizations. The other thing to mention is that, as I said before, that a lot of the, in the process of migration, new links and networks are established as well, which of course serve as a network of solidarity. Whom do you turn to within, if you want to organize, you can turn to, various people that through your process of migration. The other thing is that in a number of studies show that, for example, immigrant workers are much more collectivist than, for example, white male workers. And they put it back to the fact that white male workers, in the global north, are continuously told that they have to achieve like a career, that they have to do it by themselves, etc. And a lot of immigrants' experience actually, is collective in nature, and so they're much more likely to engage in terms of forms of collective struggle. In terms of the tools, I think you see that in my research, for example, I look at the ways in which they create democratic practices and use democracy as a resource in order to, without having a lot of resources, but they use democratic participation as a resource in order to organize their campaigns. Or you see, for example, that they develop forms of solidarity and coalition building with other immigrant communities, or, for example, with the trade union movement. So those are some of the tools that they have developed. in terms of the relationship between capitalism and the nation state, the thing is, I actually buy into the Arrighi argument that there's a logic of capital and a logic of territorialism, or as David Harvey, I think he said it like a spatial logic, because I do think that, or a geopolitical one, he even speaks about, and there's a number of people who support it. This doesn't mean that they're both, that the logic of capital and the logic of territorialism, etc., are like on equal standing. But the question is, like, how do they relate to one another? So you can say, okay, they're both autonomous, or you can, like, and I think Arrighi actually argues that they're autonomous, if I understood his argument correctly, and operate independently. Or you can actually take the view of, okay, they're interconnected logics, which reinforce each other, which you kind of presented, right? So you're saying, like, you know, you're confronted with the chicken and egg problem in a way. What came first, you know, the nation state, or, you know, the
It doesn't really matter. That's, yeah.
That's, you know,
the world we face is a meshing of the two.
Yeah. And so I think that you actually provided the answer yourself, that, and I think Satnam Virdi has argued this presciently, as well as a German scholar, Manuela Bojagiewicz, who has a Yugoslav background. They actually, and there's a number of books on the Wobblies and the IWW in the United States, which actually show that immigration controls were the product of curtailing working class radicalism. That continuously working class radicalism arose, and following that, immigration controls were put into place in order to stop working class radicalism from occurring. So following the Russian Revolution, what we see is, we see actually in the United States in 1921, we see a full stop to immigration to the United States until 1965. So the same year in which the Civil Rights Act is signed. So you can see, for example, in Germany, you can see they had a very strong policy against the so-called Slavs, or, you know, the Polish workers who came in the 19th century, who came to Germany, and again they tried to curtail the forms of self-organization, and, you know, Polish was became a forbidden language. They tried to quell any kind of working class radicalism inside of those communities, in order so that it wouldn't spill over. I think the other thing is, I think that for the nation state, it becomes, there's the logic of the nation state, and then there's mobility. So I think it's also trying to put stops to mobility, stopping working class mobility, because working class mobility would actually challenge, you know, the kind of solidarity, racialized or nationalized versions of solidarity that emerged with World War I, right? If we look at World War I and we look at the kind of periods of labor unrest that preceded World War I, they were internationalist in outlook, they were, you know, syndicalist, they were often communist inspired. And what we see, you know, with World War I is how, you know, brother against brother in Europe are pitched against each other. Countries start, you know, start developing into nation states in a much more concrete way in the wake of World War I. And you also get in parallel, you know, leading up to World War II, you start getting, and then following World War II, you get an enshrinement of, you know, the kind of modern idea of citizenship as such. And I think that part of it is geopolitical, but I think also that it served particular, like, national capitalist classes' interests, so and regional interests. So what I mean by that is for example, that the capitalist class itself often wasn't strong enough to invest into to make major infrastructural investments needed in order to enlarge the productive capacities under capitalism. So if you think about Germany and the Autobahn, or if you think about a train network, if you think about train networks, the capitalist class itself needed a state in order to control those kinds of investments and in order to centralize those kinds of investments needed to develop the productive forces within the system. That's the way I would read it. And so you start getting nation states because of the kind of accumulative effect that, you know, different capitals required in order to grow the economy. That might be one potential way of looking at it, but I would have to read more into it.
Related to this debate, can we or should we talk about nation states as absolute categories without talking about capitalism? Look at Europe. When I came to Britain in 1983, I had lots of passport problems. I should pass the Danish and the German and the Belgium, Holland, and then Britain. Now, I don't have those problems because there's only one country, European Union. So, nation state, as far as this is concerned, is not an absolute. So today there is a nation state, tomorrow there will be maybe a regional state, regional, how do you say, trade and market agreements. The second thing is that if well, that is enough, I think.
I think what you see is you see like the European Union as a power bloc which can give particular companies, provides particular companies and capitals with an infrastructure in order to compete against, you know, Asian countries like China, or to, you know, compete against the United States of America and Canada and, you know, Mexico as a trade bloc. However, the contradictions that arise through competition haven't been resolved within the European Union. So Germany still continues to compete, you know, against France in terms of productivity, in terms of, you know, what kind of capital it attracts, you know, in terms of its even tax competition, right? So like Luxembourg plays, you know, like the game of tax competition, or you see, you know, Ireland as well. So you see competition still occurring on national levels, even within inside of the European Union. I think that's an important thing. Of course, like, you know, but I think that what I said in terms of differentiation, it's important to bear in mind that Europe, you know, differentiates between EU and non-EU migrant. So even if you're, you know, if you're from Africa and you want to come into Europe, you still will face the kind of borders that you faced back in 1983. For European Union citizens, they don't apply. So what does it really say about the system? It says that to one extent it has reconfigured itself, but some of the inequities continue to persist for some groups. So we see citizens and non-citizens. So the concept of citizenship has been broadened to, you know, different groups. You know, so we as EU citizens, you have similar rights in almost all countries inside of the European Union. But if you're a non-citizen, it literally, you know, puts you into the same position as if, you know, borders are surrounding all sides.
There is also the process of state, as we know, which existed before capitalism, being transformed through privatization. So state becomes a company. That is a ongoing process as well. together with migration, together with nation state, together with capitalism, one market, whatever. And he has something to say.
There's a distinction between the state, and capitalism definitely needs a state. It needs an executive of the bourgeoisie, if you like, not only to represent the interests of that class, but sort of corporately to sort of do what capital needs. So it needs a system of laws and all of that within which to operate. And it also increasingly needs an educated workforce, needs health services provided for the workforce. So lots of things which are seen as a game of working class struggle are partly that, but they're also responding to the needs of capital for those things. So there's always a dialectical, conflictual process going on there. There's a difference between that and the way that the state is organised, which is on a territorial basis. So the nation state sort of grew up on the basis of structures that territorial divisions which existed before which capitalism inherited, if you like. But it's an interesting question whether capital has a logic towards breaking the bounds of the nation state and creating new states on a broader geographical basis, and whether the EU represents the potential formation over time, very slowly, of something like the United States or China, of sort of continental nation states. And obviously it's nothing like that yet, but it is more than just a trading bloc. The fact that the same passports you can move around within it is quite an important political distinction, and so there's that. But I was interested, you were saying that immigration controls post the First World War were brought in to as a way to dampen down the radical sort of labour movement and socialist activity which were taking place in lots of countries and that, cited the United States. But I wonder exactly how, I mean, I'm not challenging that, but I am genuinely interested in how that actually worked. What was, how did that actually, what do you actually mean by that? Because in the United States, obviously, was a very radical uprising post First World War. But there's also a lot of political repression on that. Sacco and Vanzetti was a sort of striking example of that. Sort of, so and post the First World War, you had a radicalisation, which sort of was a legacy of the 30s and that in the United States, to which McCarthyism was a repressive response. So I wonder how immigration, what role you see immigration controls playing in that repressive state response to the working class uprising. Because if I could just, I see immigration controls as part of the contradiction within the logic of, I mean, I think the logic of capital and the logic of territoriality are enmeshed, are intermeshed, but there's also contradictions that arise as a result of that. And you see in the arguments over Brexit, for instance, big capital was very anti-Brexit, but the petty bourgeoisie, if you like, which is actually still quite important in Britain, small business persons and that, were much more inclined to be Brexit supporting. So there's and the fact that the Conservative Party is Brexit supporting is a fascinating sort of political twist, that the party that's supposed to represent the interests of big business is actually forcing through a policy directly against the interests of big business in Britain and representing the interests of the petty bourgeoisie, if you like, as I see it, and the sort of more atomised working class also came round to support Brexit for reasons that for immigration reasons. I think they saw immigration as being a threat to their conditions, and so on. So I think that has been part of the reason why immigration controls have come in as well. So anyways, Barbara's time.
Any other questions? I will.
Okay, I don't really know where to sum it up. There's a lot going on. As you can see, you know, my entire thing is... So I think in the United States, for example, there were the expulsions to Russia. You know, so a lot of communists were, you know, immediately expelled to Russia as a sign. You then had particular groups. It was were Greeks, Turks, Yugoslavs, Russians, Italians, etc. were barred from 1921 onwards from entering the United States. So you can see that as an attempt of, trying to keep out the Reds and the radicals. And there was a visible public campaign, as you can see, as well as closing down the border towards Mexico, where there had been a revolution previously as well. And I think part of it is that there is a continuous, and this comes back to your question, what are the kind of reasons, or justifications for immigration controls, right? Nowadays, we see it being a security threat because of, Islam, Muslim terrorists coming in. Back in the day, in the 1920s, it was, the Reds and the Communists. So the kind of enemy continuously changes in terms of the kind of justification for why immigration controls are needed. What we can say, however, is on a general level, is that any form of resistance towards or any form of not wanting to integrate into the nation state is seen as hostile. That's why, you can see, for example, that with the growth of the nation state inside of Europe, you saw high levels of anti-Semitism against, the so-called cosmopolitan Jewry. So you see that. So I didn't quite get the question you were asking precisely. Sorry about.
You answered that actually.
Yeah.
About the immigrant, what role immigration policy in the United States played in suppressing radicalism.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of, is there anything else that I wanted to ask times? Did I answered your question? Yeah. Policy, so good to go.
One thing about organizing the migrant workers, because we are a good example of it. Between 70s to mid-90s, there were we organized service workers like cleaners, hotel workers, restaurant workers, plus textile workers. I remember chairing the northern branch of textile workers of TNG, at that time Transport and General Workers Union, now United. And it is necessary to come together in the same sector, industrial sector is very helpful. But as tools, we were translating employment rights, different type of rights and entitlements, and distributing them in different languages. And it was very helpful. And also being active, visiting the workers at workplaces, in front of the workplaces, and winning some of the industry. I remember representing the workers in more than 100 industry tribunals, and we were using this as a the case study or role models. And all these things suddenly helped us suddenly become 1,200 and something members, Turkish-speaking ones, plus others. And these are very helpful for us to organize. Also, another thing, restaurant workers, after organizing themselves, most of them were illegal workers, undocumented workers. They all got their leave to remain and right to work in this country. And then this helped us expand our organization and the membership. But in mid-90s, textile is finished, and TNG is finished, the other organization, so things are start collapsing.
But in many cases in the TNG, the way that I've, speaking to you and speaking to, the other comrade who isn't here today, what was her name again? There was a woman who used to come.
Immigrant.
Yeah. So you already had, the union, actually, workers already were organized to some way, and the union just gave it a form. So, you had the kind of networks amongst Turkish immigrants, you had the networks amongst different groups who already were supporting each other, and the TNG could, be there, sign up, and then the dues go to the union.
They first represented one of us in the Industrial Tribunal, now Employment Tribunal, Industrial Tribunal, after we organized more than 500 workers.
Yeah.
So we said, if you don't represent this woman, be pregnant, beaten by the wife of the factory owner, so they are all going to resign and move 100 union, then they go to the tribunal and win.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other comments, questions? Everybody is happy? He's been talking 1.5 hours. I am the witness.
And I talked 6 hours earlier today, so...
Thank you very much. Kumru Bashar talking about human rights in present-day Turkey.
Okay, when is that?
Next month, February. I think it is February
What sort of
last Friday of February. And she talks usually very fact-based. So you are invited, all of you. This
Cardiff. Too bad.
Thank you.